Okay, this is chapter 6 of How to Improve Blood Flow from this book. It's also called A Tale of Two Toes in a Hot Tub. How to Improve Blood Flow is actually the subtitle, but it's easier to go by. Okay, we're on chapter 6, and this chapter is going to be about leaky gut and autoimmune disease. I just found this drawing and I want to mention it. It ties in with the previous chapter. So this is the liver, and normally the liver secretes estrogen. Excess estrogen goes into the liver, and then it gets detoxified. There's sort of a phase 1 detox to add a hydroxylation group like an alcohol group, make it more water soluble. It'll be more dissolvable in the bile. And then the liver subsequently in phase 2 of detoxification, it adds a glucuronic acid. So that's just like a glucose with a carboxylic acid on it. Again, makes it more soluble, and then it's released into the bile. The bile will go in the gallbladder, and then it contracts and when a person eats a meal and goes into the intestinal tract. So this is an important point. The liver detoxifies estrogen, in a sense, excess body estrogen, and secretes it into the bile. Then it goes into the gut, and the important point is when a person, there's two types of gut flora. There is plant-based gut flora with the fiber, that's the good stuff. Okay, that does what you want. It's symbiotic with humans. And then there's the bad gut flora. That comes from eating a meat diet or from a lot of processed food diet. And the point being is we're designed to eat plants. Plant bacteria that eat the fiber are long-term symbiotic with humans. For them, our colon is a good apartment. They take care of us. They help us. Versus when a person eats a lot of processed food or meat, they get this bad gut bacteria. And these gut bacteria have more of an enzyme called glucuronidase, which will deconjugate this estrogen. They're going to cut this glucuronic acid off of the estrogen, and that's going to cause the estrogen to be reabsorbed in the blood. So people who eat meat have higher estrogen levels in their bodies. This excess estrogen levels increases the risk of premenstrual syndrome, postmenopausal hot flashes, uterine fibroids, breast cancer, uterine cancer, endometrial cancer, prostate cancer. Normally what should happen is the conjugated estrogen should be defecated out in the stool, and that's a way we would lower our estrogen levels. Okay, I just want to briefly show you the structure of estrogen before we get into more of this autoimmune leaky gut stuff, because it's going to be relevant. So estrogen is the female hormone. It's built on this backbone of cholesterol. So cholesterol has 4 rings. The important thing for cholesterol, sterol, there is an OL. The OL is like all for alcohol group, hydroxyl group. So here is the OH group, all right, represented by OL in the name. Chole means bile. Ster is like steroid hormone having these 4 rings in it. All right, so the relevance is estrogen. Most common one relevant to us is estradiol. So estrogen is like the female hormone. Di means 2. All means alcohol group. So there's 2 alcohol groups, one here and one here. A hydroxyl group and an alcohol group are the same for our purposes. Okay, the other unique thing though about the estrogen 4 rings is that you've got a benzene ring right here. There's these 3 double bonds. Unlike over here, they weren't present. And this is also called the aromatic ring, aroma, because it tends to smell nice. But anyways, our point is these 3 double bonds will resonate. What that means for our purposes is that the electrons can run around all 6 of these carbons, and they're very, very happy there. They're very stable. You can put a compound with this type of benzene ring on a shelf for years and it'll stay stable. It's a great preservative. The hydroxyl group is very antimicrobial. So you think about it, it's a perfect preservative. Good shelf life, antimicrobial. That's why it's in all these cosmetic products, moisturizers, sunscreens, deodorant, some type of phenol group. This part right here, because it's going to interact. It's going to have its antimicrobial properties and good shelf life. But unfortunately, that's also what interacts with the estrogen receptor. And I'll show you the typical way people get chumped on this. So here is bisphenol A. So bis means 2, like 2 hydroxyl groups. When it's di, that means 2, but that means that they're next to each other. When it's bis, that means there's 2 of them, but they're separate in location. So one's over here, one's over here. Okay, bisphenol A, what's unique about it is like there's 2 phenol groups, but then you've got a couple of methyl groups coming off this carbon here. So you'll see packages that'll say no BPA, BPA free, but it's a joke because all they do is switch out the middle group, put a sulfate in there, and that's called BPS. It's still got a phenol group on the end. That's the part that interacts with the estrogen receptor like a hand in a glove, and it still activates the estrogen receptor. And this is relevant because women have about 80% of autoimmune diseases in women. It's much more common in women, and it's thought that estrogen has something to do with it, that it makes the immune system behave a little bit unusually because, think about it, estrogen levels are high when you have a baby. A baby's like having a transplant. The woman has to tolerate the foreign DNA in her body to carry the baby to pregnancy. Okay, so abnormally high levels of estrogen can cause problems with the immune system. One last thing, just to show you the chemistry of how this works. So here is a benzene ring. Here's the phenol group, the hydroxyl group, and it's in the para position. Para means opposite of the major substituent. So here's the major substituent in this case, like carboxylic acid. You can remember O for ortho is like O for eyes. This is the O position or the ortho position on this benzene ring relative to the major substituent here. And then down here is the M or the meta position. It looks like a mustache, okay? And then the power position looks like a chin, okay? And the reason I go through all that is parabenzoic acids. Those are like some of the most common preservatives. And I realize some of the newer products, I know people don't want paraben preservatives in there, so they just put something else that's still an estrogen. And that's why I'm a big advisor of minimize all exposure to cosmetics and moisturizers and cream, because most of the time you're just unnecessarily exposing yourself to estrogenic chemicals, and they are transdermally absorbed typically, so I would stay away from all of them. Okay, now we're going to get more into the topic of this chapter. So here is your colon, and the point is when you eat meat, for example, the saturated fat is able to increase intestinal permeability. The bacteria of the gut, and also there's bacteria in the meat, it'll release some of its LPS endotoxins. LPS means lipopolysaccharide, and because the fats cause increased intestinal permeability, some of these LPS lipopolysaccharides will get into the blood. This is the portal vein, which travels from the intestinal tract up to the liver. But this is why you can get postprandial. Prandial means to eat, so postprandial, after eating, endotoxemia, meaning toxic effect due to endotoxin in the blood. That's where that comes from. After eating meat, increased risk of postprandial endotoxemia. Okay, I mean that's what leaky gut is, abnormally large things getting into the blood. Normally you shouldn't absorb more than 2 or 3 amino acids at a time, a dipeptide, tripeptide. When bigger chunks of protein get absorbed across this intestinal barrier into the blood, the immune system will recognize them as foreign. It'll sometimes make antibodies to them, which will then cross-react with the normal tissue. So the fact that the amino acid sequence on a protein from animal food is similar to our own, that's called molecular mimicry. And then we form antibodies to it, and then they cross-react with our own bodily tissues. That's thought to be one of the most common, if not the most common mechanism, probably the most common mechanism of autoimmune disease. So that's called molecular leaky gut with molecular mimicry and autoimmune cross-reactivity. That's the descriptive words there. Okay, so getting back to the book now. This is chapter 6, subtitle right here, Lupus and Leaky Gut. And Betty's mama got lupus. So what that's about is Jonathan Swift, the character in our story, his nickname is Jazz, we go by Jazz. He really likes Betty and he wants to go out with her, but Betty's not interested in him because he's got athlete's foot. And then he found out that her mother has lupus, a very serious autoimmune disease. So he's hoping if he can maybe figure out how to help her mom, she'll go out with him. And he talks to his friend named Aristotle Abelard, and that's what the AA initials are for. So Aristotle, of course, tried to classify all the known information in the world back in the days of the ancient Greeks, like 370 BC. And then Abelard was the great, most famous Aristotelian scholar of the Middle Ages, and he has a whole story. We won't even go into it, but so Jonathan Swift, Jazz, goes to Abelard, his friend who knows a lot, and asks him for help. And here's what he says to him. He says, Betty's mom got lupus. If I could figure out how to help her mom, then maybe Betty will let me bang her. Abelard says, I've been reading about leaky gut. And by the way, there's a lot of jokes in here to make my friends laugh, so don't take it too seriously, all right? Okay, I think leaky gut might be part of the cause of her lupus. And Abelard's been reading about. Jazz, what's leaky gut? Aristotle Abelard. Leaky gut is when your gut has holes in it that allow absorption of big pieces of protein. And then Jazz, well, why does the gut have holes in it? And so what if a big piece of protein is absorbed? Abelard, first we got to define some terms. Meat is protein and fat. Plants are carbohydrate and fiber. Normally, the gastric acid prevents bacterial growth in the stomach and most of the small bowel. Most of the gut bacteria are colonic bacteria. Good gut bacteria thrive on fiber. Fiber comes from plants. So the good gut bacteria comes from eating plant foods. Meat doesn't have any fiber. Processed food has hardly any fiber. The gut has two main types of bacteria. Either the bad bacteria, somebody eats a meat and processed food diet, most Americans, standard American diet, SAD diet. Good bacteria feed on fiber from plants. So when you eat plants, you give food to your good gut bacteria. The good gut bacteria will take the fiber and they'll convert it into short-chain fatty acids. In particular, the 4-carbon fatty acid called butyric acid, or butyrate when it's deprotonated. And it comes off the name, like butane, 4-carbon, alkane. So butyrate is a preferred food of the colon lining cells. About 2/3 of their calories will come from that under good circumstances when fiber is available. And they maintain tight junctions, so that keeps the cells tightly opposed to each other, so nothing unwanted can leak in between them and get into the blood. There's only a single cell thick, the gut lining. The intestinal tract is called the enteric tract, so the intestinal lining cells are also called the enterocytes. They're also called the lining cells of a lumen, are also called epithelial cells. You'll sometimes hear them called gut epithelial cells. It's all the same thing. Tight junctions maintain controlled absorption of proteins, so you only ingest little pieces at a time, nothing bigger than a tripeptide. Tight junctions prevent big pieces of animal protein from being absorbed. Okay, when you eat bad food, meat, oils, fried food, junk food, other crappy processed food, you get bad bacteria. Meat diet deprives the colon lining cells of the fiber and thus deprives them of their butyric acid, and they start having loose junctions rather than tight junctions. When the diet lacks fiber, the colonic enterocytes, intercellular junctions become loose. Okay, a little repetitive there. Big chunks of animal protein can be absorbed. Okay, the loose junctions allow these big chunks that are too big. The immune system recognizes them as foreign invaders, makes antibodies to the invading animal protein chunks. The fact that the amino acid sequence of the animal protein ingested is similar to our own body's amino acid sequences in our own human proteins, that's called molecular mimicry. Then when the antibodies cross-react against our own tissues, that's called cross-reactivity. And leaky gut due to molecular mimicry with antibody cross-reactivity is the main mechanism of autoimmune disease. About 80% of autoimmune disease is in women, and that's thought to probably be because of the effects of estrogen on the immune system. Having a baby is like incubating a transplant. And high levels of estrogen influence the immune system. Meat has a lot of saturated fat and bacteria. The sat fat is thought to cause increased intestinal permeability, also known as leaky gut, and allow bacterial endotoxin, LPS, lipopolysaccharide, across our gut lining and into our blood. And this is a mechanism of leaky gut. Inflammatory diseases in general are more common in meat eaters, relatively rare in plant eaters. Okay, here's a John McDougall quote. Dairy, meat, and oil cause leaky gut and autoimmune arthritis. Vegetable oil is toxic to the intestinal lining. There are no benefits for eating vegetable oil and fish oil. So that's a quote from Dr. John McDougall. Okay, how long does it take to flip your colon bacteria from the bad ones to the good one when you switch over to a plant-based diet? About 2 weeks, probably a little less than that. You'll have the farts for about 2 weeks because the bacteria is almost like a turf battle in your colon. Who's going to dominate? That's also if you're eating a vegan diet, for a month in a row, and then all of a sudden you go to some social event and you eat this processed food and meat or junk food, you'll get queasy in your gut because now you're sort of feeding the residuals of those bad bacteria that are still living down there, some of them. Leaky gut can cause all kinds of problems. That's beyond the scope of this chapter, this lecture, but be aware it can be associated with anxiety and psychiatric conditions, emotional conditions. Hippocrates says all disease begins in the gut, and this is just a little joke on Adam Smith. The invisible hand of fiber protects your health. Fiber does a lot of good things. You want to get that fiber. Okay, what are the risk factors for leaky gut? We talked about meat. It's got all the fat. It doesn't have any fiber, the good stuff. It's also got a sialic acid called Nu-5GC, especially beef and dairy, and that mimics the sialic acids that are normally present on human cells. And basically, it's close enough to the human sialic acids that the gut will absorb it and even put it onto human cells, but our immune system still recognizes it as foreign, and that causes an inflammatory reaction. So that's called xeno, as in foreign sialitis, inflammation of sialic acids, and you'll hear about that sometimes. So just more inflammation related to eating meat. Postprandial lipotoxemia, we talked about that with after eating you get LPS toxicity, endotoxemia. You can also just use the word lipotoxemia for the effect of excessive dietary fat in general, predisposing to all kinds of problems, including diabetes. Processed food is bad because, again, it has very little fiber. It also has emulsifiers, which are somewhat similar to a fatty acid, meaning that they might have a tail of carbons that's nonpolar, but they'll also have then a polar fatty acid-like component that enables them to cause leaky gut. So they can be similar to fatty acids, increasing intestinal permeability when they're present in large amounts. Emulsifiers are partly polar and partly nonpolar. They're used to combine polar and nonpolar things in processed food. That's why they're routinely in processed foods. Processed foods will often have herbicides, especially if they're non-organic, more herbicides than pesticides. High-fat diet, vegetable oils, we talked about that. Antibiotics will also kill a lot of your good gut bacteria, can lead to an overgrowth of the bad bacteria. Chlorinated water, F- in water, contribute. With a carbon filter, you can remove the chlorinated water. With a reverse osmosis filter, the F-. Swallowed toothpaste with F-, possibly swallowed triclosan in some toothpaste. By the way, I don't even use toothpaste anymore. I'll brush my teeth about once or twice a week just with a brush, just to get off any potential biofilms in which bacteria might live in there, but I don't even use toothpaste. I always floss at night. I'll floss during the day if I eat anything a little bit sweet, even like a banana or something. Some medications can cause leaky gut, like NSAIDs, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. Possibly some of the artificial sweeteners, possibly carbonated beverages due to the phosphoric acid. Some people for gluten, but I don't ever think about gluten. I just eat whatever I want. It's irrelevant for me. Excess dietary sodium possibly, and some people can make their T-cell lymphocytes hyperactive and increase autoimmune disease. Non-stick cookware, it's thought that the PFOAs are like F- related and that they can cause some problems. Dishwasher soap, it can be harmful to your intestinal bacteria. I mean, it's only if it's probably present in large amounts, but I'll rinse my dish off if it comes from the dishwasher. Excessive psychological stress and stress equivalents also can increase the amount of leaky gut. So stress equivalents are lack of sleep, caffeine, corticosteroid medications. What are the common autoimmune diseases? Diabetes type 1, and diabetes type 1, and T. Colin Campbell writes this, and Dr. McDougall and others, and Dr. Bernard, I think. There's a lot of papers suggesting that it's associated with dairy, diabetes type 1, and those are reasons to try not to give, a baby cow's milk. Multiple sclerosis is thought associated with dairy. Rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, ankylosing spondylitis with meat and processed food. What is the epidemiology of autoimmune disease? Well, we talked about women having it more, and it's also a lot more common in northern areas. So the question arises, why is it more common in northern areas? Less sunshine can mean less vitamin D, especially what matters is the activated form of vitamin D, D3. Milk is often drank more in northern areas because, it helped people survive the winter, having dairy cattle. But the problem is when you drink milk, all that calcium will suppress activation of vitamin D3. Vitamin D3 is sort of a regulator. It makes your immune system do what it's supposed to. So when you get less vitamin D3 available, you can have problems with your immune system being a little hyperreactive in ways you don't want. What you measure in the blood is just a vitamin D2 test, not the vitamin D3. D3 is really the super potent active one that does what you want it to do. Northerners in general eat more meat. They're more prone to leaky gut. That's another reason why these things can be more common in northern areas. Activated vitamin D3, like we said, get your immune system to do what it's supposed to. Why is Parkinson's disease potentially an autoimmune disease? It might be related to alpha-synuclein, and because gut symptoms often are early in Parkinson's disease, like constipation, for example. If the patient's had that vagus nerve, which is cranial nerve 10 that connects the intestinal tract to the brain, if that's been severed with a vagotomy, which they used to do in the past for surgeries for ulcers, those patients would be less likely to get Parkinson's disease. Okay, the usual answer, like what should you do, is the same old story. Eat low-fat, low-sodium vegan diet. You'll get lots of fiber that way. Roy Swank, MD, he was a neurologist from Canada originally, ended up going to Oregon, and he had read the paper showing that, first of all, during World War II, the countries, as they ate a lot less meat and dairy, there were less episodes of multiple sclerosis. And in addition, he saw that if you look at Norway, the patients living in the center of Norway, where they had more dairy, had more multiple sclerosis than the ones on the coastal areas who, did eat fish, but it just seemed that the dairy had something to make it worse. And he put all his multiple sclerosis patients on a low-fat diet, trying to keep it below 15%, especially reducing animal fat, sat fat, and whatnot. And he has the best results of any doctor in the world. On a 34-year follow-up, this is incredible, by the way, 34-year follow-up, his multiple sclerosis patients had 95% maintained ability for their ADLs, activities of daily living. That's incredible. Those are incredible numbers. Incredible numbers. The best of any approach to MS ever in the history of the world. Okay, Sari Stanchik is sort of a new nutrition doctor, and she had a pretty good, interesting lecture about, she was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, and she recovered from it, made a great recovery. And, she's real smart. She said, look, I read the identical twin data, and basically they don't both usually get MS, so therefore it's not just due to genetics. And then she started studying the diet, and she was amazed at how useful that was. She's also amazed by the fact that how come she never was taught that? How come her other doctors didn't know that? That's not widely known, but if you care about MS, Roy Swank is a guy to read about, trust me. And then he later on did some work with Dr. McDougall. DrMcDougall.com at his website, he's got lots of testimonials of patients of his who had different types of autoimmune disease, and when they went on a vegan diet, their leaky gut went away and their condition markedly improved. And that includes for rheumatoid arthritis, SLE, MS, inflammatory bowel disease, and a bunch of other related autoimmune diseases, including the wife Nelson. That guy Nelson's a real smart guy. He runs Veg Sources, his YouTube channel. Okay, so drmcdougall.com, lots of good testimonials on recovering from autoimmune disease with a low-fat vegan diet. Roy Swank, here's one of his great papers. Here's one paper about antibody cross-reactivity between myelin glycoprotein and milk protein butyrophyllin in multiple sclerosis. So what they're basically saying is the milk protein butyrophyllin, when big chunks of that were absorbed, according to this author, they think that led to antibody cross-reactivity with myelin. That's the fatty coating of the neurons in the brain. So they're proposing this as a mechanism possibly for causing multiple sclerosis. Negative effects of high-fat diet and intestinal permeability. Like we said, it increases gut permeability, that's sort of the medical word for leaky gut, increased intestinal permeability. We talked about high-fat diet being associated with endotoxemia that originates in the gut. Yeah, the high-fat diet increases gut permeability, and then the LPS that are on the meat or other bacteria in the vicinity can get across the gut barrier at that point. Then we talked about the xenocellulitis. Here's a paper on it. Mechanism of uptake and incorporation of non-human, so from beef and dairy, sialic acid, new 5-GC into cells. And it can get into the cell, but then the immune system says, hey, this don't belong here. This guy Fasano has written a lot about gluten enteropathy and whatnot. He's kind of famous for that. He's like at one of the Harvard hospitals. Stephanie Seneff wrote this famous book, Toxic Legacy. That's about herbicides especially. Manzel, his article here is about sodium, excess dietary sodium can increase autoimmune disease. So anyways, hope that's helpful.